So we're going to look at how to use blockchain to build supply chains. By the way, there is a report involved with this, and there's a link to the report where you can access it with the QR code on your on the tables. So, and it should be very interesting, so you can check it out. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I know we're getting toward the end of the day, so grab a coffee. So we can perk each other up. I'd love to have this be engaging, so please think of some questions. If you have them, we can do it at the end. But if you really have a burning question, I'll take it in the middle of the panel as well. I love making it an interactive conversation. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Karen Ottoni. I'm with Hyperledger Foundation. We are a nonprofit, part of the Linux Foundation, that cultivates the communities that build open source technologies for many of the blockchain use cases that we've been talking about today. It was almost perfect that the last panel ended on the Walmart example, because it actually uses Hyperledger Fabric. It's the Walmart Food Trust use case where, and Walmart took a really innovative approach where they actually forced all their suppliers to get into this consortium. So really driving innovation in that sense, and we can talk about how organizations drive innovation, or we invite them to come. And so a lot of the applications of this technology are using open source, including some of the panelists that we have here today. There's a lot of the SDGs that touch on supply chain more than I think we realize. There's a few I think mentioned up there, but in the end, everything needs to kind of get somewhere or get done with something, right? And so I think when we all went through the pandemic a few years ago, or the last few years, supply chain became a household name in a way that it never was before, where people were really thinking about and experiencing viscerally the effect of the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in supply chain. So that's something that I want to talk about here today as well. So let's get to our panelists. We've got Dale and Ettore and Wes. Please just briefly introduce yourself, but most importantly, tell us how your current role intersects with blockchain, to give us a sense and a background, because you all come from very different organizations, but supply chain touches everything, right?
Hi, I'm Dale Chrystie. I'm business fellow and blockchain strategist for FedEx. I bring you greetings from Memphis, and I lead the blockchain and Web3 efforts for FedEx.
Hi, I'm Ettore Rossetti from Save the Children. I've been there for 19 years. Save the Children has been around for 103 and counting. So I've been around for at least 17% of the organization's existence. We work in 120 countries, giving kids three things: health, education, and protection from harm, both natural disasters and man-made conflicts. I'm head of Web3 globally.
Hey everyone, my name is Wes Geisenberger. I help lead the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund, and in the GBBC world, I also help lead the Carbon Emissions Token Task Force as part of the Interwork Alliance. And the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund is one of 4 funds in the HBAR Foundation, and we're part of the Hedera ecosystem. And our mission, the fund, is to bring the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. And we do that through open source digital public goods and grants to different applications building on Hedera. And from a supply chain perspective, a lot of those applications are looking to better quantify things like emissions calculations, decarbonize supply chains through carbon credits, and better enable sustainability across our ecosystem.
So I'd love to hear from each of your different perspectives. How are you involved in bringing greater sustainability to supply chains using this technology? But also, let's talk about how maybe what you're working on is addressing some of the weaknesses that we've witnessed in the last few years in supply chains.
From our point of view, again, we go to 220 countries and territories, so our view is truly global. As I would say, at that level, at the International Space Station level, there is no company, there is no industry, there are no borders. Data knows no geographic borders. We saw that, I've been in supply chain and transportation my entire career, and none of you cared about it until the pandemic. And then we became kind of sexy at that point, which is what's going on. I can't get up my paper towels and everything else from that point of view. And I would tell you that I led the first blockchain use case at FedEx in 2017. And during that period of time, kind of the aha moment for me was that truly global scenario where I buy something from you and supply and demand are separated by broker, forwarder, brother-in-law. I know some lady, all these people that sit between you and me from that point of view. And in a digitized world, in a truly paperless transaction world, it's a very different supply chain. Right now, we've got all these papers and requirements and ports of entry and various things like that have to happen. But in a digitized world, in a truly paperless world, when I buy something from you, you can actually provide buyer, seller, country of origin, et cetera, directly to the customs agency of the import. And then that data can move at the speed of data and not at the physical speed. So certainly we see on the horizon a very different world, although it's not today and it's not tomorrow. But we're connected here just briefly. Our connection to GBBC is that I'm chairman of the BITA Standards Council, Blockchain and Transport Alliance Standards Council. We're focused on open source and royalty-free data standards globally. And we merged with GBBC a couple of months ago. FedEx, UPS, and others are on that board. And our focus is to be the global harmonizer for global standards. There's a lot of standards out there, but there's not a common language at this point. There are gaps, there are overlaps, and we're working our way through that as part of the GSMI 4.0 initiative.
I love Dale's visual analogy of the satellite view of Earth, and the borders disappear, the man-made borders, when you're that high. And if we all had that view, I think we'd have a different perspective on humanity and children. At Save the Children during the pandemic, I will use an example of supply chain disruption in a little bit of a different way. When the US educational system announced that schools would be closed, we knew that it would be a crisis for children who relied on school not only for education, but also for food. And so we scrambled into motion a campaign led by our ambassador, Jennifer Gardner, and her friend and colleague, Amy Adams. And we came up with a campaign called Save with Stories. And it was storytelling on social media, Instagram, where grandparents can read to their children who were displaced when we all were sheltering from home. So that's an example of a different kind of supply chain disruption of education, but also for food insecurity. And what we did was, and it's analogous to the decentralized trend of the blockchain, we decentralized the services we provided. So instead of every child centrally going to a school that was now closed, we had our staff and volunteer deliver essentials both for food and for education to homes across America. So that's how we adapted to the supply chain disruption.
So in the HBAR Foundation and the Hedera ecosystem, we spend a lot of time in supply chains at a couple different levels. We spend supply chain focus and time through our grant resources and open source infrastructure that enables that. So one of the tools we have is called The Guardian. It's an open source digital public good that allows you to define methodologies for things like accounting or things like processes. And that process workflow engine enables you to define exactly how you're supposed to collect data from who and attribute to which party is saying what. Sometimes it could be an attestation about something maybe being organic, or sometimes it could be an attestation around, say, carbon emissions. But a lot of times it's simple things like digital product passports. And so we have users as part of not just the Hedera Governing Council, but our ecosystem, like Avery Dennison. And Avery Dennison both tracks digital product passports on Hedera to understand which specific good, the attributes about that good, go to which specific party tied to their different digital identifiers. And of course, they've enabled different layers of data on top of that, like carbon emissions tracking, where they've enabled even things like carbon emissions tokenization, followed by what they call carbon reduction tokens to enable that offset for their customers. And that process allows for better transparency in supply chains, where in a future we can have a fully digital view of not just the good, but the direct relation to the impact of that good from a carbon perspective, a carbon accounting perspective, and ultimately, the reduction of that through things like offsets when we can't further reduce.
Thank you all. Dale, could you touch a little bit more on BITA and what exactly that is, the reason for it coming under the GBBC, and why standards are important, why open standards are important?
Yeah, our first journey in 2017, 2018, we did a lot of deep diving, and we really felt, let's just go out and build a global supply chain blockchain. And we did, and it worked, and it was just fine. The only problem was it wouldn't scale. And everything in our world pretty much is based on standards, whether that's the traffic lights out here at the intersection or many, many other examples, the electrical grid, lots and lots of things. And we take it all for granted from that point of view. And again, global commerce is such that while we go to 220 countries and territories, the global supply chain also includes everything to a bicycle delivery company. And we didn't ultimately feel we could create this and then put a FedEx logo on it and charge our competitors to use it or vice versa, whatever the case may be. So we realized early on that really standards were going to be important. And we were founding members of the BITA Standards Council in 2017. And we did work through standards. We started creating things. But again, with that, not to have a contradictory view of that, if I'm in the International Space Station and I've now taken all of you with me to that view, and in a conference setting, that's my very first slide, by the way, which is here's this view from space. So I need you to go up with me for just a few minutes, and this is our perspective. At that point, we had to do something about that, and we think it's going to take global standards. So UPS is also a founding member of BITA, and we've worked with DHL in other regards as well. And so that's what I refer to as co-opetition. It's not about where we compete, it's about where we can agree. And that was one of the questions on the previous panel. I wanted to your question, I wanted to raise my hand from the back. It's co-opetition. It'll take all of us. Where can we agree? We can agree that reducing friction across borders is huge to us, to our customers, to global commerce. But it's going to take a common data language to do that. And that's where the standards come into play. The connection to GBBC is that we truly felt at a global level, there's a lot of standards out there and a lot of good people working on these standards, but we didn't see a role that had been identified yet as a global harmonizer of those standards. So, a lot of musicians walking around, if you will, we think it needs an orchestra conductor. And that's the role we want to play. We aren't trying to dominate that. We are happy to lead and work with other like-minded entities. But it's going to take all of us to do that. So part of the early efforts here are around GSMI 4.0. There's a supply chain work stream of that. And I, along with my colleague from UPS, are co-chairs of that. We're working with Diana. And that's essentially becomes the research branch of BITA. So now that we've identified kind of a backbone of what we're trying to accomplish with movement, it could start with raw materials. It could move all the way from your purchase all the way to delivery. And there's a whole series of steps there that I'm not going to bore you with. And then we use that and then start aligning up. What does UN say? What does World Customs say? What does ISO say? What do these other standards entities say? And now let's push those all together and say, have we solved this? Do we all agree, for example, on country code? That's probably not very controversial, but there's a lot of stuff out there that there are different people that describe it different ways. And if we can identify and then map it and then identify overlaps and gaps, that gives us the roadmap to work with these other like-minded entities for open source and royalty-free data standards. And when, not if, but when we get to that point from a global commerce point of view, it will be a very different global supply chain. Now that data can move again at the speed of data. Now you can send something that's being shipped through customs and you are a trusted shipper. They know exactly who you are. Don't slow that down. That's the happy path. They don't know Dale, but they do know you. So that would give different experience. And they can use the same technology we've been talking about all day long. Artificial intelligence, they can analyze it, they can optimize it, they can get to predictive models and prescriptive models, just like the enterprises and many other people are using as well. So we think it's a very different global supply chain. We think foundationally, it starts with standards.
You mentioned that you really have to bring part of the goal there is bringing everyone together, but how do you get to that critical mass where you can really make an impact? What are the barriers? Because not everybody wants to necessarily cooperate or compete. I can't say it. So what are the barriers and how do you foresee overcoming them?
We don't think it'll scale without that. And we think there are key kind of global thinkers as are represented in this room that understand that we have to work together to embrace, to lean into this new technology. And so we have those conversations with World Customs and with others. And again, the UPSs and DHLs of the world. And we think we can get it to a tipping point. We think it's going to take essentially adults at the table. We're not trying to own this. We don't think we can slap a FedEx logo on this and do this. We think it is foundational for all. Of course, we're in business to be in business. And no different than my Android phone that has an open platform, you and I could build a proprietary app that sits on top of that. That's fine. But most people are simply trying to jump to the proprietary part without building the interstate highway system needs to be built before you can put a fast food restaurant on the interstate highway system. And so we just keep having the same conversations on this broad kind of global thought leadership level. And we think there's enough people out there that we think we can get to that tipping point.
Yeah. Thank you. Ettore, can you tell us a little bit more about Save the Children's, how the innovation and how you're rethinking the model of humanitarian assistance and how you distribute your resources?
Yeah, sure, Karen. So Save the Children, as far as SDGs goes, we mapped a lot of them, but the one that includes innovation is SDG 9. And innovation is in the culture and in the DNA of Save the Children ever since our founding by Eglantine Jebb, who asserted that all children have human rights. And at the time, that was a revolutionary idea. It was an innovative idea. Ever since then, Save the Children has been a leader in innovation. So for example, in the United States, when we were founded in 1932, we came up with the hot lunch program in schools, which is now adopted, right? So there's public-private partnerships oftentimes create or in a catalyst for innovation and change, right? Innovation simply means doing something different. And if you're doing something different, either in a disruptive way or an incremental way, it's still innovation. So regarding how we're thinking about the blockchain, how we're thinking about Web3 technologies, and how might that change Save the Children, how might we adapt to it and use it to disrupt ourselves, we imagine a future where we would build a non-governmental, a nonprofit organization on the blockchain. What would that mean? What would that mean in terms of transparency? So the cost to run a nonprofit, the overhead cost, what is the tolerance for mining fees or gas fees? That would be the equivalent analogy. What would the donor be willing to pay for that? And let's make sure that that is transparent and can be audited and inspected on the blockchain. Last year, on average, 86% of all of our expenditures went to program delivery. So if you had this efficient organization built on a blockchain, then in theory, in smart contracts, those kinds of percentages can be built in. But one thing I will say is transparency is inspiring, but also frightening for many organizations. And so I think it behooves us as nonprofit leaders to communicate our value proposition and to be proud of what we do with the resources that we have. If you're familiar with Dan Pallotta's TED Talk that went viral and his film now, documentary called Uncharitable, where nonprofits are held to a double standard with for-profits. Folks scrutinize things like overhead and CEO income, yet they don't compare that to the for-profit world. And I think the pursuits of nonprofits aren't about not for profit, but rather for impact. And it's really important that we are transparent, but also that we're proud of where our resources go.
Do you think that that's something that Save the Children would explore shifting more towards?
So absolutely, we're right now piloting some supply chain products. Let's first of all, earlier today we heard about World Food Program's building blocks. So we're looking at that in Kenya. And that's an example, a great example of an open source technology that talk about co-opetition, in our space, we don't even call them competitors, we call them peers, because we're all in it together to solve these humanitarian problems. So if organizations can come together and use blockchain technology like building blocks to make sure that beneficiaries aren't left behind, they're not duplicated, then that creates more efficiency in the system. And I think that's one of the knocks on rather large NGOs is perhaps they're not efficient. That's not necessarily true. It is that we are big in scale in terms of big in impact. So we are looking at this concept in the blockchain, and was also discussed earlier, is this notion of wallet, the metaphor of a wallet, of an application that sits on a phone, that mobile phones are very ubiquitous, no matter where you are. So imagine a future where every child had access to a mobile app through which Save the Children could deliver its services. And so, for example, the first use case we're looking at is our cash and voucher assistance programs. We're delivering digital cash on the blockchain and then tokenizing our services in the form of vouchers. So what if we gave you a token for food or a token for education? And those tokens will be non-transferable, and you can identify who the recipient is. I think that would bring a lot of transparency and speed and effectiveness to our sector.
Yeah, and that brings up, you know, the impact and challenges of getting to the last mile, which I want to talk about later and get all your perspectives on that. But before that, I want to come to Wes, and if you could tell a little bit more about how supply chains can support ESG initiatives, some of the examples that you've seen with carbon equity and the emissions task force as well.
Yeah, so I think there's some really interesting opportunities on how we think about value and different value chains, right? So we've talked a lot about carbon emissions related to supply chains, and we have the task force, but there's also the carbon credit side of the market. We heard from some folks earlier around the digitization of that process. And we have digitization of data, but there's also the digitization of value, right? Like stable coins to community wallets. And as we announced today from the Voluntary Ecological Markets Task Force, the digital measurement, reporting, and verification spec updates, there's ways to map value into those accounts to measure things like financial equity. And as we think about, bringing data into this digital format from specific parties, from specific data wallets to attest that this is this verifier or auditor, this is this local community. If we can map value back to those different parties, we can actually form new types of data relationships where we can uncover forms of value like financial equity into local communities and carbon credit projects. And we hear from carbon market registries, that a certain percent goes back to the community. But in recent news stories, we found in some cases after investigation, it may not be the same amount has gotten back to that community. And we can prove in the value chains, in that data supply chain, if you will, of what impact is happening. We can prove both the data and the financial value that could go back to funds. Maybe it's access to clean water. Maybe it's access to certain community impact initiatives that every dollar is being spent properly, which, doesn't just serve for NGOs, but it serves for local communities and better community governance. On the carbon emission side of that, though, we can better align the rules so that in our supply chains, we can see if something's really emitting a metric ton. We can reference, across multiple companies in the value chain and better see what that impact looks like. And as part of the carbon emission task force, what we're doing is we're better representing that in the standard and the specification. And so we're expecting to release that specification later this year. And today we're also, talking about the relevancy of where that spec may apply. And so as part of our updates, we'll be releasing a paper that I think actually just came out 20 minutes ago or so on the relevance of that for emissions trading systems. And so these emissions trading systems are all based on budgets or allowances, and a lot of the large companies around the world are subject to these budgets. And of course, if we're over emitting, we need to go be able to either pay a penalty or buy specific emissions allowances under that. And we can better see the relevance of these standards in those supply chains as folks look to buy either further permits or look to go settle as they go into into regulated markets, and we can actually see their carbon impact.
So, I mean, it seems a big part of that seems to be, greater transparency, standardization, access to the data is going to help drive a lot of what we can see in terms of impact and ESG initiatives.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different layers you can look at it from. You can look at it in the emissions accounting, but you can also take that emissions accounting data where we have rules for scopes 1, 2, and 3, or even product lifecycle standards. And those can be used in ESG reporting. One of the things one of our goals of the HBAR Foundation is when it comes to ESG reporting is to make ESG reporting credible. And the way that we see, that happening is by laying out all those rule sets digitally, using digital measurement reporting and verification against a specific scope 1, 2, or 3 rule set. And then take that same exact data in your reporting and align that to your specific ESG reporting tools, whether it's TCFD, CDP, where you're collecting that data. And we eventually actually see an automation capability where you can go from one emissions accounting rule set into your ESG reporting, and you actually know the granular information, exactly who attested it, who audited it, what's the rule set. And that's something that we see as a really big opportunity. And when folks go to report, we can say, is this rule set the right rule set, or should you be doing something that's a little more robust? And we see that as a big opportunity, both in the task force setting, as well as in our own goals from a foundation and enabling folks through different grants that, our ecosystem makes available to companies applying.
There's a lot of granularity there, right? So what about privacy? Could you tell us a little bit about the Hedera Guardian ecosystem and, the importance of privacy, obviously, in all this as well?
Right. So the Guardian, think of it as a tool that allows you not just to map the rule set, but an operating system. And that operating system allows you to lay out all the roles, the actors who fulfill those roles, and then eventually it's the data that they produce using tools like decentralized identifiers that issue verifiable credentials. But one of the things that we've enabled as part of our releases earlier this year is a capability called selective disclosure. In kind of more blockchain or crypto native speak, you may hear zero knowledge proofs as kind of the more niche phrase. But the selective disclosure capability allows companies or different parties to decide what's private, what's confidential. Maybe you don't want a specific business process to be known, but you want someone like an auditor to say, this is true, they've collected data in the right way, or it goes into a calculation that's known, that's public. And so with the Guardian, when you're mapping those public rules and you're collecting this data, selective disclosure allows you to disclose it to the parties you want to see, and maybe not the rest of the world, while still maintaining the cryptographic trust where you get the encrypted data on a public ledger. And that's what we've enabled. And it's something that we're really excited as part of not just an open source tool in the Guardian, but open source decentralized identifier and verifiable credential wallets that fit into that workflow of multiple parties.
So coming back to what we talked earlier about the last mile, how can we effectively implement these supply chain solutions where there's maybe poor limited enforcement or poor quality data, or just, you getting to the door, something to the door of someone far off, somewhere in the world, or you getting to someone, right, that needs that resource. How do each of you, from your perspectives, think about what are the barriers there to the last mile, and how are you overcoming all of those?
Well, ours is we think of FedEx in both the physical world and the digital world. We think we're kind of at the intersection of those two. So the physical world, if I ask you, what do you know about FedEx? Most of you, or most people that work for FedEx are going to say, well, I ordered something and they picked it up and delivered it to me, right? So you're going to think of the physical example of that. We also think we're at the intersection of the digital world. And if you think of essentially a digital twin of that, a digitized version of that package, that's the next 50 years of FedEx is some combination of both of those. So the physical world, we're still going to get it to you. We still figured out a way to do that. We're going to take a picture of it at the doorstep. We're going to continue to add value to that experience from that point of view. The digitization of that also speeds this up. It streamlines it. It makes it much more seamless. It reduces a lot of friction in those processes. And so we think these kinds of emerging technologies are going to help us with that. Again, we think kind of the trifecta of moving forward is blockchain, sensors, IoT sensors, and AI. And we think increasingly the last panel kind of contemplated, I'll just go there for a second, contemplated what's next, where does this go? I think of AI as being a really good blender. It's a better way of preparing something than what we've had, but it still relies on the same source. If you still put the same vegetables that you've been cutting on a table and you put it into a blender, it's going to puree it, it's going to do other things to it. But the source data of that is critical. And that's where we think these opportunities take us to a new place. So when we can use the exhaust of blockchain, we can use the exhaust of sensors, temperature, humidity, and various other things like that. And then you can put them into the large models, the AI and the machine learning and those kinds of things. Now you're off to the races and doing some very different things. And that ties back to final mile as well.
From a Save the Children perspective, that last mile problem is one that's a challenge for us in the sector. We don't have all the answers, but we have some of the questions. And they include, one solution is, can you, if you're digitizing your cash delivery, if you're digitizing your token delivery, then can you create a closed loop ecosystem where you bring merchants in so that families in need, when they receive cash, they can actually use, let's say, the digital currency in their local market. That's one possible solution. Another possible solution is, if it's not a closed loop system and you have a digital token, but you have no place to redeem it, then working with an off-ramp provider or an exchange to convert that to local fiat. Or in the case of Bitcoin, you probably have seen a Bitcoin ATM machine. You even see them now in supermarkets across the US, are also available in other parts of Africa and around the world. So imagine if you could then cash out your Bitcoin right from a crypto ATM machine. That's another possible solution to last mile. And if you didn't have a mobile phone, in theory, you could print out a QR code and then use that at a point of redemption. So as technology becomes more pervasive and more ubiquitous, we think there's going to be a leveling up of humanity potentially, and that could help us reach the most difficult to reach populations.
For the last mile for us, we see a few different angles to it. We see both supply chain last mile. We also see the local communities. And one of the key things is enabling folks to have their voice heard in a digital format. In the carbon credit market or the biodiversity market, that's not always as straightforward as it may seem. Making sure we get attestations from every single party involved in the data supply chain today is nearly impossible. There's no registry, verifier, project developer who's able to take all that information in digitally and have it represented to that specific identity of who made that attestation, whether it's multiple satellites who are providing satellite data to a project, every member of the community who's supplying data, or contributing to that supply of data, right? Because it could come from an AI model on top of the satellite. It could come from an average of data from local communities, or measuring the width of trees, and community members are doing that. And so in our view, we try to get to that last mile by providing wallets that can allow attestations of specific information, and we get more granular information in that process. In the future, what I think that means is value is going to be attributed back to those specific data providers, and that value is actually going to be considered financial equity in things like carbon credit projects. And that's where we can ultimately build a better correlation of who's providing information to what value they get in the overall value of the project.
And can you just quickly clarify what you mean by financial equity?
When we talk about that, it's mostly in the sense of communities own projects. You may have a project developer working with that community, but that value, when you say buy a $20 credit, what percentage goes back to the community versus every other contractor, registry, verifier, satellite data provider, project developer, financier, any other role? And there could sometimes be a half dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen parties involved. And if we could have specific attestations, specific wallets that don't just provide, value in the sense of tokens, but they can provide data and receive value in return, we can get a better attribution of where the value is coming from, what impacts being driven by those communities, by folks working on specific projects, rather than just seeing financiers, verifiers, and registries that are working with project developers.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Before we wrap it up, I want to open the floor, see if there are any questions for the panel. And if not, I'll ask a final question. Do you want to run up?
This is more a question for Wes. I guess, how do you see kind of the granularity of data and some of the tools that you're suggesting impact the ETS market, so the European emissions market for carbon credits or for cap and trade?
So with the CET, I see a great opportunity to improve the credibility of systems beyond what they already are. I think having the ETS markets in general, and there's many around the world besides the EU, in addition to the the leadership steps they've taken, we can go on this continuum of improving the cap and trade model when best available technologies come to market. And so we see things like the Guardian, we see other different technologies that better enable MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, improve the credibility of not just the data that goes against the rules. Today, most of that data is collected in Excel spreadsheets. You can click on a tab that says calculate a direct measurement approach or an alternate approach. We see a world that if we can lay out those rules, understand every single data point in measurement, reporting, and verification, that's a much better outcome than, say, the calculated model. And if we can get to a point where we actually know every single party that's contributing that data while still protecting that information that's considered proprietary, that's an improved model from where we are today. And by better providing granularity to get to that calculated approach, we can have a more accurate and less estimates driven model. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to get rid of things like emission factors. Emission factors will continue to exist, but having a clear balance sheet for your scope 1 emissions, which are the majority of the traded balances, that's the ideal. And just to be very clear, the cap and trade system isn't trading carbon emissions tokens, it's trading the allocations around them. And so if we have a better initial accounting for them, those allocations just become that much more precise and that much more credible.
Thank you, Wes. Any other questions? I don't think so. So I just wanted to ask some final thoughts. What is sort of the next frontier? And a lot of the things that we've been talking about today are not the same things we were talking about at this event last year. And so what do you see ahead for you in terms of how we can achieve the SDGs, make impact on sustainability via blockchain solutions for supply chain? Anybody, go ahead.
Go for it.
So I think this year, we're a full year into the carbon emissions token task force. So that's a pretty exciting thing. We're that much closer to a draft 1 of a specification, which allows people to build with standards, right? I know Dale talked a little about standards from a logistics perspective, but having clear definitions makes life a lot easier. Now, for us on the voluntary side of the market, we're 2 years into the voluntary ecological markets task force, and now we got a DMRV spec. I can tell you today, with our Guardian ecosystem for the carbon credit side of the market, from the release today of the DMRV spec, it'll probably be a month or two till the Guardian has fully conformant DMRV standards. But that's pretty quick in iteration. We have a fully open source tool. We can work that in so we can index every single registry's asset, every single property in that specification. So a year from now, I hope to be able to see every single asset indexed against those properties. In carbon emissions, I think that's even in some ways more exciting because every single company on the planet, if we have an MRV spec in a year, having a clear way to compare every company's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, is something, maybe it's not a year, maybe it's a little bit longer. That's pretty exciting because, comparing FedEx to UPS, for example, may actually change a consumer's thought about which company, somebody goes to work with because one may be more transparent than the other. When we think about things like scope 3, the indirect emissions, where there's 15 categories, Imagine being able to take those specifications, look at them on a public ledger, and say, I'm more likely to work with this company because they're doing a really good job in being rigorous in their accounting, and I trust them to be more environmentally friendly. Personally, I make brand decisions that way when I go buy from Patagonia. I get excited about their work in the environment, and so I buy from them. But maybe that's going to be something, something in a more similar, vein for supply chain tracking and carbon footprints, and I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
For Save the Children, I think if our founder, Eglantine Jebb, were alive today, she would add to her Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which was adopted by the UN, and she would add connectivity to it. And what do I mean by that? I think internet connectivity, but also being connected and included in the economy is really important, especially for children. Think a children's universal basic income. I think about the openness of the blockchain, the fact that it's agnostic, that it's inclusive, it's portable, and it's like a universal serial bus. The USB, in theory, can be connected to multiple kinds of devices, doesn't matter the brand of the device. And I think that's what we need to strive for. I think it's a human right, and it's natural. In the time of the pandemic, we saw when we were all disconnected, but technology can connect us. And if technology can connect humanity, I think we can solve most of humanity's problems, especially those facing children.
I wasn't here last year, so I can't speak to what was covered there, but I'll just bet you weren't talking about ChatGPT. So certainly AI has been added to this. I'm one person that thinks that could be the killer app for blockchain. It certainly is a better tool and a completely different tool, but one of the first things you hear about it is, well, be careful, you're not sure where that source is. And I think blockchain can be that source. We'll see. I might be completely wrong on that one, but that's a possible. It may get swept along with some of those kinds of things. As to the sustainability piece, again, I've said it a couple of times, I'll say it one final time, 220 countries and territories. It's a big world, right? There's a lot, and we're doing a lot in all those spaces. It certainly behooves us, and it behooves our competitors, and it behooves global commerce for us to figure out how to do this better and to make it more seamless and to reduce friction and to increase the Walmart food issues were referenced and various things like that. It makes sense for all of us. Digital product passports, a good example of that in the EU is battery passports that they're experimenting with right now and talking about, creates a circular economy. That circular economy is what we're really talking about here, where a battery was created, that I bought it, then you bought the car from me, and then it was recycled or reclaimed. That's going to be more and more typical. That we're going to see more and more of those things. That helps all of us. Again, I don't need to see all of your private information to move your product. Those are just additional kind of logistics data points. You'll all be working through what's the source and who's all those things and all that, but it all comes together at that International Space Station, at that view that we're talking about. All of what we're talking about in here all starts coming together. So the more we can have these conversations, the more we can go across our typical, I don't spend much time with Save the Children, but I've learned a lot about that. The more we can do these things, it's a win-win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to GBBC for bringing us all together as well. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. I look forward to seeing what we're talking about next year and what we can see more transparently to make the world more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So interesting. And I'll just mention Wes talked about a report that is available on the QR code if you would like to check that out.